And now I want to introduce our first speaker. Joseph Smook is the co-founder of People Power, that's People Power Media, and who are the creators of the animated cartoon Priced Out that tells the story of affordability of housing in San Francisco. Okay, Joseph, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks, Art. Good afternoon. As Art said, I'm Joseph Smook with People Power Media, producers of the animated feature Priced Out, Why You Can't Afford a Place to Live in San Francisco. I'm also organizer with the Race and Equity in All Planning Coalition, and I am very honored to be able to participate in this discussion today. I've been asked to present on a couple of different topics. The first is to provide a clear comparison between propositions D and E. And already it gets kind of muddled because D and E sound similar, but D is dangerous, and we'll be talking a little bit why. Both of these measures are on the ballot you probably recently received, which is for the November 8th election. After that, I'm going to address an article that ran in yesterday's Chronicle about how we might be able to reconsider the future of the financial district. So first, let's jump into propositions D and E. Before I get too deep into these measures, I just want to remind ourselves that both of these measures kind of drift into this streamlining game about streamlining housing. And we can remember that if we're going to be streamlining development, we had better get something significant from it. So just really quick, both propositions aim to streamline three different types of housing developments: 100% affordable housing, educator housing, and mixed market rate and below market rate housing. And both propositions use the word affordable in their titles, but the similarities pretty much end there. So most of the differences between the two measures pertain to the mixed market and below market rate developments. So that's what I'll be highlighting most. So first, Proposition E streamlines developments with a higher percentage of affordable units on site than Proposition D, even though it may look different when you read the descriptions of the measures. Proposition E actually provides 30% of the units as below market, and D is 25%. But when you actually look at the word affordable, Proposition E actually maintains our current affordability standards. So new affordable units would actually serve those households with low and middle incomes, whereas Proposition D actually redefines what affordable means so that it becomes 140% of the area median income. And if you don't know what that is, that's fine. All you need to know is that it's more expensive than market rate. So it's actually not affordable. Proposition E streamlines developments that include a percentage of 2- and 3-bedroom homes, whereas Proposition D doesn't have any such requirement. So the effect of D is that developers could build all tiny studio units that cost market rate and still qualify for streamlining. So as noted, both propositions streamline approvals for housing projects, and streamlining is defined by both as requiring the city to issue planning approvals within 6 months for buildings over 150 units. But Proposition E requires these approved projects to actually start construction within 2 years of their approval, whereas Proposition D gives developers 3 years, and then there's all kinds of loopholes where developers can kind of commodify their entitlements and not start construction for several years. Both propositions claim to be good for union construction workers, but Proposition D doesn't actually do anything that incentivizes developers to use union labor. Proposition E streamlines projects that meet the skilled and trained labor standard, which union workers meet, which provides a real incentive for developers for hiring from the building trades. With respect to environmental protections for affordable housing, Proposition D eliminates them. Proposition E does not. Keeping environmental review is good due diligence because all housing should still be safe and not environmentally damaging. And as far as we know, no 100% affordable housing development has ever been stopped or even really held up by going through environmental review. Proposition E also goes another whole level beyond just this streamlining we've just been going over. It actually ensures good governance by adding a powerful layer of budget accountability. Proposition E requires 2 annual reports from the city, one on the amount of money being budgeted to be spent to fund affordable housing, and one at the end of each year reporting on what was actually spent on affordable housing. These reports contribute to public transparency about where money is actually going for affordable housing. Proposition D doesn't require this and actually transfers power to the mayor to be able to cut deals with developers to build on public lands without any approval or review from the Board of Supervisors, which just means more corruption and nepotism. Lastly, Proposition D is funded and supported by tech billionaires and developers, while Proposition E is supported by the California Nurses Association, the Teachers Union, the Building Trades, the Labor Council, Council of Community Housing Organizations, the Sierra Club, the Tenants Union, the Democratic Party, and of course the Race and Equity and All Planning Coalition. So that's kind of overview of D&E. I'm just going to move into a few remarks about this article that ran in the Chronicle yesterday. Even if you haven't read it yet, I'm just going to highlight some points that about this notion of converting empty office buildings into housing. And the first thing I will note is that in terms of downtown conversions of office buildings to housing, if the city had listened to Calvin, who will be speaking next, and listened to Sue Hester back in the 1970s, we probably wouldn't be in this mess. So just a nod to those who could foresee the problems ahead. So the reporter, Noah Arroyo, who wrote the article, I spent several hours talking with him. It was quite a long process that resulted in a very short quote. And there were a number of points that I'm going to make right now that I made to him that didn't end up in the article. So number one is that it's not just a matter of repurposing commercial buildings into residential, that the financial district is basically the worst example of a commercial approach, of a revenue-focused approach to planning. And then what we need to do is revision the financial district through the lens of people-centered planning. And actually creating resilient, diverse communities is the key to long-term viability. So we shouldn't just be talking about, is it office or is it housing, but really looking at holistic planning. And number two, if we're converting office buildings into housing, we have to be focused on affordable housing. And number three, developers and landlords shouldn't be the beneficiaries of government subsidies to complete these conversions. These for-profit businesses have no interest in long-term affordability. If a commercial landlord can't figure out how to make their building work, then the city should just buy the building at a discounted value, then invest in the residential conversion, which should then be led and sponsored by one of our amazing San Francisco-based nonprofit affordable housing developers. And then number four is I also propose that existing commercial landlords could partner with nonprofit housing developers to own and manage the affordable housing to make sure that subsidies go into creating long-term affordable housing, which is what should be prioritized. And think about it, all the janitors, maintenance workers, retail workers, restaurant workers who would be working in this new diverse neighborhood desperately need long-term affordable housing. That affordable housing for these workers should be here, close to where they work. And it is this type of housing and this type of community development vision that should be prioritized so we can create a new people-centered, resilient neighborhood like the kinds of neighborhoods we already have throughout the rest of San Francisco. So that's all I've got, Art. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Joseph. Really appreciate it. Okay, Art, so we're gonna have Q&A after both speakers, if that's all right. So I'll introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Calvin Welch, who's a founding member and former director of the Council of Community Housing Organizations, also known as CHOO, I believe, or CCHO. He's now retired. Current housing and land use member, board of the Haight-Ashbury Neighborhood Council. So he was a current housing and land use member of CHOO, correct, Calvin?
I was
Correct introduction for me.
yeah, I was project director of the Council of Community Housing Organizations.
Okay.
So I've been asked to talk about how do you get deeply affordable housing for seniors, and what that means is, it seems to me, 3 specific tasks, or tasks involving 3 specific characteristics, and an understanding, beginning understanding of the failure of the market to provide housing able to be afforded by the overwhelming majority of not only seniors in San Francisco, but the overwhelming majority of families and single people. The market system of housing production is based upon profit. And that reality has created a situation in which, in a land poor city, 47 square miles, only about a sixth of it able to be developed for housing, has given owners of that land extraordinary ability to set prices. The response of the development community has been to try to convince the general public to deregulate the housing market by removing local control over its placement and density. The notion is that if we increase the supply of market rate housing by increasing the number of market rate units we can build on a given plot of land, through the magic of the marketplace, the prices will drop. And that over time, housing at this higher level of density, without any concerns for traffic impacts, impacts on neighborhoods serving businesses and services, with no analysis of the cumulative impact on the environment, all of those things removed, we will over time produce housing at market rates that people can afford. The fact that that has never happened anywhere in the world does not stop the argument continually being made, which is at the heart of Proposition D. Proposition D seeks to increase the density of market rate housing at a level that the proponents claim will somehow produce housing able to address San Francisco's homeless crisis. If one believes that, one believes almost anything. The reality of the situation is market rate housing over time in San Francisco increases in cost. It doesn't decrease in cost. So the reality that we have to address is that market rate housing cannot produce housing able to be afforded by the overwhelming majority of working people, retired people, and families with children, for the simple fact that those people do not earn enough income to pay the necessary costs for the development of market rate housing. So the three principles that will produce affordable housing is first the necessity of continuing to regulate market rate development. Market rate development cannot be allowed, especially residential development, cannot be allowed to happen anywhere at any density levels without increasing the cost of that housing. That's a reality. Market-based affordable housing solutions, legalizing in-laws, allowing backyard units, secondary units, all of which assume no rent control and the ability of the new owner to provide that housing at a level that will recoup the cost of its production and provide a profit for the developer, dooms it to not being affordable. It is important for San Franciscans to understand that the reason that we have virtually any families left in the city and any seniors left in the city is that San Francisco has rent control, has condominium conversion controls, and other market controls that limits the amount of market rate housing and the direction of market rate housing, providing housing that will be affordable. So the necessity of continuing to regulate market rate housing, both its construction and its operation, is absolutely crucial. And organizations such as yours should continue to advocate strongly for continued market controls. The second reality that we must understand about affordable housing is that in a city in which there is no affordable land, in which there are no affordable building materials, in which there are no affordable professional services, there is no below market rate architects, there are no below market rate engineers, there are no below market rate concrete suppliers. All of the component parts of housing construction are market rate. We live in a capitalist society. That's the way it works. So for affordable housing to be produced, there has to be an intermediary between the cost, the market rate cost of producing that housing and providing that housing at a price that most low-income people can afford. And there is only one way that that can be done, and it's the way that has worked for banks. It is the way that has worked for large agricultural companies. It's the way that has worked for oil companies, and that is direct government subsidies. Government subsidies must be used to write down the cost, the market rate cost of acquiring property, real property, and the market rate costs of construction. Because what unaffordable housing means is that those costs are so high that the price that it has to be offered at exceeds the ability of the overwhelming majority of San Francisco residents to afford. So those market rate costs must be discounted by a direct subsidy, which leads us to the third critical leg of the stool, of the three-legged stool of affordable housing. So it's continued market rate regulation, continued subsidies of affordable housing, and the third is the development of a housing delivery system that is based upon actual income levels, which means the necessity of income targets. That we don't assume that the market buying and selling at market rates will somehow produce through magic units that will be able to be afforded by someone making $500 a month or receiving $500 a month in SSI benefits. No such magic occurs in the marketplace. The only way in which we can fairly provide the subsidies needed to produce housing, to write down the end cost of housing, is to make sure that we target that housing that is built with those subsidies to specific income levels. That is increasingly unpopular, even amongst people who claim to be progressives. It is the heart of Proposition D, in my opinion, to access public subsidies for market rate housing. We now know that the national policy, the national anti-inflation policy, has driven interest rates up to an extreme level that makes market rate housing difficult, if not impossible, to produce. And so these market rate producers, people who are producing housing that exceeds market rate, current market rate levels, that under Proposition D would magically be defined as affordable housing, would make themselves available to public subsidies, which is absolutely critical in producing genuine affordable housing. They wanted to subsidize their market rate housing. That's why Proposition D says there's no public hearing, there's no vote of the Board of Supervisors on the use of public land or public subsidies, that these are deals done in the mayor's office. And we all know, I think it's pretty clear, how low-income people benefit from deals done in the mayor's office of San Francisco. So the third leg of the stool is to earmark income levels to meet the needs of those in deepest need for affordable housing, which means currently about half of the affordable housing that we produce in San Francisco is able to be afforded by people earning below 50% of median income, which currently in San Francisco, 50% of median for a single person is a household up to $48,000, and for a four-person household is about $80,000. That is about half of the housing produced in San Francisco is above that level, and about half is below that level. We don't produce enough housing for income levels below 30% of median. That's what we need to advocate for. That's what you all need to be advocating for. What is the average Social Security income for a San Francisco resident, expressed in area median income? It's about 9% of area median income, 9-10% of area median income. Do you know how many housing units we produce in San Francisco able to be afforded by people earning 10% of median income? Not many. We have to shift the discussion from producing housing able to be afforded by people earning 140% of median, which Proposition D would do, to housing able to be afforded by people earning 20% of median and 10% of median. We must insist that a specific population of units, a specific number of units each year must impact those income levels. And the only way that we can express that in a meaningful way is in terms of an area median income number, is in terms of an income target. So those are the three absolutely critical legs to an affordable housing program. The continued and strengthening of the regulation of the market. It is important for us all to understand that the majority of San Francisco housing units, are price controlled by local regulation. The largest percentage, of course, is rent control, but there's also all of the affordable housing, about 35,000 units, all of public housing, all of Section 8 housing, all have controlled prices. So the majority of the housing stock in San Francisco the simple majority is under price controls. We must defend and expand those market regulations. Second, we must produce more and deeper subsidies. Proposition C of 3 years ago went far to doing that and providing subsidies by taxing the largest corporations in San Francisco to provide housing for currently homeless people who are zero income people. And then finally, we must strongly target to the lowest level of AMI possible, all of the affordable housing that we built. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you very much, Calvin. I've endeavored to take some notes. I put them in the chat. So I'd like you and others to fact check it, just to keep your very clear and good presentation, the facts of it in mind. So thanks for being so concise and to the point, and we have plenty of time for Q&A. So if you have a question, raise your hand physically like this, or using the reaction button, or you can put it in the chat, but you have a much better chance of getting your question asked if you raise your hand. If nobody has a question, I can just say just one right off the bat. What is the biggest barrier to implementation of the proposals you have for getting more affordable housing, Calvin?
Well, it's the availability of subsidy. Let me give you a small example. Gavin Newsom is gearing up to run for president of the United States. And he's running around the state bragging about what he's done for affordable housing. The state budget for all levels of affordability totals about $1 billion, which is up. I will give him that. In the last 4 years, San Francisco voters have approved subsidies of $1.5 billion a year. So we are producing more subsidy for housing in San Francisco than Gavin Newsom has produced for the state of California. The state used to do general obligation bonds on a regular basis for affordable housing production. No governor has done an affordable housing bond for over 15 years. At the bare minimum, there should be an affordable housing bond every year from the state. Every year, the state should allocate $1 billion. But more importantly, the state should remove the barriers to affordable housing at the local level, which they have erected through a variety of laws that weaken rent control and allow conversions of affordable housing to market rate housing. So there's two things that the state can do. One, actually regulate the private housing market, and two, produce more subsidy. But the principal task that we face is creating sufficient subsidy. I think Joseph knows this and perhaps can speak more directly to it. But to meet the current state mandate for affordable housing, the state has a mandate for affordable housing. We've got to produce somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 units. There's nowhere near, the state is not providing any money to produce those affordable units. We're somehow to do that all on our own. Yet the state figures the number. I'll defer to Joseph. I believe the number to meet that is over $20 billion. Joseph, what is the number?
Yeah, we've calculated actually, because we're kind of hemmed in by this low-income housing tax credit program right now. There's all these kind of programs seeded by Reaganomics and public-private partnerships and all this kind of bullshit. So if you look at a real robust program that Calvin's talking about, it would cost roughly $4 billion a year for San Francisco to be able to meet its affordable housing mandate that's come down from the state. And it'd be great to produce 46,000 new affordable housing units in the next 8 years. And as Calvin said, we have to stop thinking about, okay, so basically the way that the state has it set up right now is if we don't meet those mandates, that they're going to withhold our affordable housing subsidies, and they're going to withhold transportation subsidies, rather than saying, let's partner together, let's make this happen, because the state has plenty of resources to leverage what the city of San Francisco has come up with, which, as Calvin said, is significant. And if we were able to partner together, we could come up with that $4 billion a year. There's really no question that we could. But instead, that the way they've got it set up is that if we're not meeting those goals, they'll actually withhold subsidies. So everything's just kind of backwards right now.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 questions in the queue with the hands and at least one in the chat. So now up first is David Elliott Lewis. Keep your question as brief as you can, so we have as much time as possible for everybody else. Go ahead.
First, a quick announcement. Tomorrow there'll be a ballot forum that'll be talking also about these and props C and M. It'll be both on Zoom and live. The live event will actually have food at 150 Golden Gate, St. Anthony's. I'm wondering if there's any polling on, especially on D and E, and how it's leaning, and also what are the arguments that these billionaire developers are going to use to try to sell D? I know the mayor is backing it, and there's a lot of money behind D. The YIMBYs are behind it, but are they just going to argue it's just going to produce more housing than E, or how are they going to try to sell it to us? Because I need to be able to counter their arguments. Could anyone address both polling and marketing?
I'm not aware of polling. Perhaps Joseph is. They're on television with ads, and the ads basically say you should vote for D because the Board of Supervisors put E on the ballot, and we all know what bums the Board of Supervisors are. Second, they claim that only D will produce more affordable housing. Just straight up, which is an absolute and complete lie. But that's the name of the game in politics today is if you've got enough money, you've got enough, you got a big megaphone and you can lie. So, I mean, that's their argument straight up that Proposition D will produce more affordable housing. It will cut red tape, and red tape is the reason that we have this problem. And it will cut all of the red tape. And Proposition E was put on by the Board of Supervisors, and we know what fools they are.
Got it. Thank you, Calvin, and thank you for your presentation. Very helpful.
Okay, our next question comes from Misha Steer. You need to unmute yourself, Misha.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for putting this on, Misha. Nice to meet everyone. Hey, Joseph. Not to distract, but I just, because I have such expert here, I was just wondering if you could speak briefly to like what effect like 211 and SB6 might have in San Francisco in terms of you know, like I know with like Home SF, you know, SB 35 leads people to not take advantage of like our nice program. So like say Prop E passes, I don't know if these are directly connected, but I guess I'm just asking like what happened at the state this year? What does that mean for, you know, for our local ability to you know, control the way benefits are incentivized and such?
Yeah, no, Misha, it's a really good question. What Misha's referring to is that it was been a busy year in Sacramento. Basically, our legislators are doing what Calvin described. They want to deregulate the market, and they keep trying every kind of trick in the book. So you can kind of go through the different numbers, you know, of all the assembly bills and Senate bills that have been kind of tried and failed, and they come back with a new iteration. And one of the ones that failed a few years ago was SB 50. They basically came back with a new kind of strategy around that called AB 2011, a new sponsor, a new tactic. And where there was huge opposition before, there wasn't this time. But what's it all about? Basically, what they're trying to do is what Calvin said. It's just been a massive effort to kind of deregulate market rate housing. And as Calvin said, like, where you can build and how big you can build. Basically, developers want those decisions to be deregulated and to take not just the Board of Supervisors out of the picture, which is what Misha mentioned, but all of us as well. So basically making sure, and these are Democrats, right, who are undermining democracy, like right there in Sacramento and preemptively as well. So everybody's been trying to figure out how can San Francisco continue to operate in light of SB 6, AB 2011, and then we, you know, there are other bills that are kind of teed up to come back in the next legislative cycle as well. And all of these are basically positioned to basically take all of us out of being able to question what gets developed where and how and for whom. So this kind of Proposition D that's moving locally is very similar to like the school board recall, the DA recall, where it's basically big money coming in and tricking voters and kind of trying to move the electorate in San Francisco towards a kind of political perspective that's way to the right, but using language that's really tricky and making it look like these are progressive values. We need to have a safer city. We need to have more density with more neighbors. And they use language that make it look like we're trying to be visionary and trying to build good communities, but it's really pulling San Francisco's electorate to the right. And so it's, you know, the three kind of three-legged stool that Calvin mentioned, all of those are really important for us to stay focused on so that we're not getting tricked. But trying to undo all of the damage that's being done at the state right now, it's actually pretty scary, I have to admit, and trying to figure out how we're going to position the housing element, which is our housing policies for the city for the next 8 years, and trying to figure out how we're going to position that in light of all these new state laws that are basically preempting any land use control that any of our communities can have in any kind of self-determination for seniors, for families, for people with disabilities. It's a huge fight. I can't say it any other way. It's actually pretty scary. So yeah, anyway, thanks for asking that, Nisha.
Okay, thank you. Now, next question from Ann Kolochidis. Go ahead, Ann.
Well, thanks. Thank you both. That was great. Joe, I wanted to follow up on something Joseph was saying because my question centered around that. You know, there's a lot of people that I know that are falling into this YIMBY trap, and they think it's cool and they think it's like young, and I don't know, I can't, without getting cranky, it's like really impossible to talk to them about it. I just wonder if you have any tips on how to, you know, the local control. Oh my God, they want to give it up. They can't wait for HCD to come in and clean the house, you know, and stuff like that. And I don't, anyway, any advice on how to speak it?
I'll just say a couple of remarks, and then I want to turn it over to Calvin, who I know has been thinking about this for a long time. Through the Race and Equity in All Planning Coalition, we've been really focused on a proactive agenda, because we know that if we keep fighting the AB 2011s, we keep fighting the SB 6s, like we do, we do what we can. But what we want to do is energize base around a proactive vision, exactly what you're kind of referring to, Ann. So we know that organizations in the REP coalition have been developing community plans around holistic communities, around affordable housing, around site selection for decades, going back to the Chinatown Community Plan, 1985. And so what we've done is we've collected all these plans into what we're calling the Citywide People's Plan for Equity and Land Use. And we're going to be taking this to the Board of Supervisors on November 15th. You can mark this on your calendar, when the Board of Supervisors is going to be sitting as what's called a committee of the whole, where we get to speak as, you know, as the public in front of the full Board of Supervisors about the housing element. And we're going to be presenting our community vision. And, you know, hopefully we can start to reclaim some of the discussion around all of this and say that our communities are really the experts, and we need to get back to kind of a community vision around how our communities develop. It's the only thing that we can think of right now, but I'm sure Calvin's got more ideas on this.
Thank you.
I don't know if any of you remember 3 movies, actually, all by the same name, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. That's basically what's happened to us at Sacramento. That the Democratic Party has been totally and completely subsumed by real estate and developer interests. Historically, real estate and developer interests were local. For those of you I know, you know, remember the local developers, Walter Shorenstein and those folks, have now been superseded by international flows of capital. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the victory of world capitalism, globalization and financialization. There's a fascinating UN study on the financialization of housing, which is a phenomenon across the world and is feeding, amongst other things, right-wing populism in Eastern Europe. Every economy that has a decent economy has an affordable housing crisis. Every city in the United States that has a functioning economy has an affordable housing crisis. And that's because the national governments have abrogated any policy or meaningful programs to private capital. That it is the flow of private capital that now, for example, a leading purchaser of single-family homes in the Bay Area are Wall Street firms, going on the speculation that the YIMBY line of doing in single-family homes, that somehow single-family homes is the heart of racism, even though in San Francisco, the majority, the largest single-family home neighborhood in the city historically has been Bayview Honors Point. And it's as if the line of the YIMBY is single-family homes is the source of like residential racism, and we must do in single-family homes. Who's buying single-family homes? Wall Street firms. And they're speculating on their demolition and building 4 units, 5 units on those single family home plots. The reality in San Francisco is most families in San Francisco live in single family homes. Most seniors live in extended families in senior family homes. The west side of the city, go to the health department and check out their sites, their maps, have more seniors than the east side of the city. And the overwhelming majority of those seniors reside in multi-generational households and single-family homes. So if we're going to demolish single-family homes in San Francisco and rezone them as the YIMBYs want, then how many of the new housing units will house families and how many will house seniors? And the answer is 0 zip. So that's the answer to YIMBYs, is to actually cite fact. They treasure and trade in bullshit and flim-flammery, not fact. No one looks at the facts. Okay, so the fact of the matter is that local government has been the principal approver of housing and development issues in California when local real estate dominated the market. They didn't want the state setting principles because it would interfere with their ability at the local level to get whatever they want. Now that international capital, national money is involved in housing development, they don't want local control. They want centralized state control. And Gavin Newsom and our Democratic legislators have bought into that because that's the source of financing their campaigns. Don't vote for Phil Tang ever again. He has voted for every one of these measures in Sacramento. Don't vote for Wiener ever again. I don't care if the only opponent is a left-handed chicken. Elect the left-handed chicken. These guys are totally aimed at pushing policies that disenfranchise us all. That's what YIMBYism is. It's about handing local control, communities, community facilities, and all. There was a great heartwarming story in the Chronicle today about the Mission and COVID, and a community coalition in the Mission that linked up with the UCSF and did an incredible job in addressing the impact of COVID in the Mission. YIMBYs want to do in that mission. They want to displace all of those Latinos that are there and replace them with people who look like them. I mean, that's the counter to YIMBYs, is facts. Community is not bad. Building community is not bad. Neighborhoods are not bad. Neighborhood organizations are neighbors helping neighbors. And stand up and defend your neighborhood.
Thank you, Calvin. Let's have one more question before we take a break, and that goes to Matt Holtz, and we'll take Teresa's question in the chat after the break.
Hi, thanks for the discussion. It's certainly laudable, increasing affordable housing, and especially enlightening about the measures. So I appreciate it. At the same time, though, I wonder, shouldn't we be considering the other side of the equation? There's also an income crisis. Shouldn't we be talking about increasing the minimum wage so that people can afford housing, increasing fixed incomes, more unions, liberalizing home sharing rights, and other ways for seniors to earn additional income so that they can afford housing? And in fact, isn't there a danger if we should be too successful in coming up with flooding the market with affordable housing, the corporations would feel justified then in lowering their wages and keeping them low. Well, you can just go get subsidies, like Walmart did when they were telling people to handing out forms to apply for welfare. Isn't that a danger in pressing the affordable housing side of the issue exclusively and not working on increasing people's income?
I'll let Joseph, let me just say this. Housing is a function of income. You're absolutely correct. You cannot talk about the affordable housing crisis that we face in this country without also understanding the wage pressure in real terms on the working class in the United States and the world since the 1980s, without question. I don't think we ever have to worry, however, that we're going to produce so much affordable housing that corporations can credibly argue that we don't need to pay workers. After all, in San Francisco, and this is one of the distinctions between D and E, we use 100% union labor to produce affordable housing, and we pay for that market rate for that labor. There will always be a need for unions. You are absolutely correct. We have to advocate for people's income as well, but we don't run the fear, just as we're never going to get income so high that all of the working class become millionaires and we no longer need unions. The same is true with affordable. We'll never produce too much affordable housing, I don't believe. Joseph?
Yeah, no, I agree, Calvin. Just to layer on to what you're saying, some more facts. As Calvin was saying, it's really good to know facts. When you look at these are statistics that are actually in the planning department's housing element. They just don't like to put them front and center. When you look at how much housing has been produced in San Francisco from 1950 to the current year, we've actually developed almost 1.5 units of housing for every new addition of population in San Francisco. So there's this kind of myth, of course, that we're not producing enough housing, right? So we're producing plenty of housing in total. That's number one. But the number two stat that I want to highlight is that over that period, real wages have only increased twofold, whereas the price of housing has increased sixfold. So I just want to underscore what Calvin's saying. I don't think we're going to produce too much affordable housing where all of a sudden we're going to start having that impact the wage discussion. We talk about the financialization of housing. It's really important that Calvin brought that up. And that's what's causing that sixfold increase in housing costs is the financialization of housing. We also have financialization of wages. And that is the assumption that we're not going to increase people's wages. We're going to give them easy access to credit. And then we're going to control people's financials through credit cards, right? And through debt, basically. So we have debt on housing, right? We saw that through the financial crisis in 2008. And we see consumer debt as well. So what we need to do is kind of break the yoke of both of those things, and affordable housing, massive affordable housing production is just one of the pieces of that puzzle.
Thank you, Joseph. And I'd like this at this point to ask for a 5-minute break. We'll stop the recording and come back at 2:07, if that's okay with everybody. And think about, let's build an agenda that the Gray Panthers can advocate for in the last 20 minutes or so of our discussion after the break. I'd like to see if we can do that. That's just my thought. Okay, we'll see you in 5 minutes, okay? Thank you. And we have one question that was left unasked. It was in the chat. And Calvin and Joseph, if you can answer this question, I'm going to read it. It says it's from Terry Palmer.
And they've
And the question is, it's kind of hard to believe that half of SF housing is affordable by 50% AMI. When a studio apartment the size of a closet is renting for $2,500 to $3,000. Also in even BMR units that look affordable according to their price have ridiculous HOA dues. So is this one half of house below 50% AMI still true?
No, the reader misunderstood. I perhaps misspoke. Of the affordable housing produced, there's been roughly 35,000 affordable housing units produced since the 1980 in San Francisco by faith and community-based nonprofits. Of that number, 50% are below. 50% are below. Half are 50% or below. Not of the general population. No, not of the 395,000 housing units in San Francisco. No, I'm not saying that.
Oh, okay, that answers my question, yeah.
No, it's of the affordable units.
Okay,
The question should be, how come they're all not that affordable? And that's been because of the lack of subsidies. The lower the higher the AMI affordability level, the less subsidy is required. So a good deal of subsidy is required to produce a unit able to be afforded by someone earning 20% of median, as opposed to someone earning 80% of median.
Okay, we have another question from the chat. From David and Alice, what is your opinion of the idea of specific housing for teachers or artists? ?
We already have a requirement for teacher housing. I believe E also, Proposition E reinforces that. Artist housing, that's a whole nother story that we need to talk about, I guess, at some other time. I spent way too much of my life on live work lofts. Do people remember the live work loft catastrophe in this town? That was aimed at being for artists, but organized artists did not want to limit it by AMI. They did not want income requirements placed on live work lofts. And we argued round and round and round, unless you put income restrictions on live work loft, they're going to be market rate. And that's what happened. Live work lofts became the great fraud of the 90s in this town. And that was for artist housing that in fact became market rate housing, and artists couldn't afford it.
We have another
That's
question.
because the organized artists did not want to include in the legislation income targets.
Another question in the chat from Misha Steer. Given where real estate cycle seems to be headed, I wonder how left tactics are supposed to shift. Thinking back to 08 or even the late 70s, the last time we saw an inflation crisis, y'all got us rent control. What's the different during a recession in terms of real estate capital's strategy on what material possibilities does that open up for campaigns?
Do you want to go, Joseph?
Sure. I mean, I'll just speak optimistically. Is that I mean, we've already seen capital starting to dry up in the market rate housing realm, and there's this fantasy, like Calvin and I have been talking about, that deregulation is just going to somehow magically produce all of this new market rate housing, which is going to bring housing prices down, because somehow the equilibrium between supply and demand is somewhere in the range that all of us can afford, which is sheer fantasy, obviously. So what we're starting to see, and this is actually literally already happening, is that people are starting to see that the impious emperor has no clothes, because everybody knows that the market rate housing that's being produced, nobody can afford. And so, and also people are starting to question whether we need to be building more of something that people can't afford. And what we're going to see is that there's all these new state laws that you asked about earlier, Misha, of kind of taking the voice of the people away, deregulating the market. And people are going to start to see over the next couple of years that no market rate housing is actually being produced. And so this kind of erosion of the sand underneath the house of cards, I don't know, I'm going to go on with these cliches for a while. But basically, I'm thinking, and like I said, I think we're already starting to see it, is that people are starting to see that this myth, the YIMBY myth, is really doesn't have any validity at all. And that the market really only acts as the benefit of the market. It doesn't act, there's no market rate developer who gets up in the morning and says, I wonder if I build a 300 unit development in the next couple of years, if that's going to bring the price of housing down. Like that's just not how people go to work. And I don't think they're going to get a bank loan if that's the economic condition that they're building into. And we're certainly seeing that right now with interest rates being high and all of those market rate costs that Calvin listed earlier, the price of materials, the price of labor, the price of land, those aren't going down. But the price of capital is going up. So you're not going to see a whole lot of development. So I'm thinking if we set our kind of campaign infrastructure up properly, as you're kind of suggesting, Misha, and we've got clear goals in terms of community participation, community self-empowerment, building affordable housing, and really defining what is affordable based on what our communities in need and what we need for housing, increasing wages, all the things that y'all are discussing, is that we start to make those demands, they're going to be resonating more and more as we get deeper into kind of the myth of the YIMBYs crumbling around them.
Our next question is from Teresa Flandrich. Go ahead, Teresa.
Hi, everyone. What I was thinking about in terms of subsidies is, it has in the past had such a negative connotation. Like if only you had worked more or, saved your money, you too would be able to purchase, or you too would be able to afford these rents, right? However, when you look at, what's happening with Elon Musk and Newsom talking about the billions of dollars he received in subsidies, if that would be a tactic that maybe we could start using, is turning that around, shifting the definition of subsidies, because I think that has gotten in the way of a lot of things, right? So just wondering what you think of that.
Well, Teresa, glad to hear from you. I think that's only a problem on the left. If you take a look at San Francisco voters, I mean, there can be no subsidy without voter support. There hasn't been a bond measure or a tax measure that taxes the wealthy to provide subsidies for the less wealthy, fail in the last 7 years or 8 years in San Francisco. I think it's only the left that has a problem with that. It's very odd. So the Democratic Socialists don't even like to use the term affordable housing. They use this rather obscure term, social housing, which is an appropriation of a British term, which means affordable housing. In Britain, social housing is affordable housing, which includes a subsidy. DSA has a problem with subsidies. It's really bizarre to me that the left has this problem with subsidies. I don't believe that the general public has a problem if it's a well thought out program and presented in a politically competent way. So I think it's a problem in search it's an issue in search of a problem. I don't believe we have to make it more attractive. I think we just have to produce housing that can be afforded by many people. So I'm having been involved in the first general obligation bond for affordable housing in the history of the state, and San Francisco did do that. Now every municipality, every major municipality in California is doing affordable housing bonds. I don't think it's a problem.
Okay.
Thanks.
Social housing came up. It came up in the chat as well. I have a positive view of social housing, not that I'm an expert or anything, but I understand that Vienna, Austria has no homeless people and very affordable housing. So I'd like anybody who wants to make a further statement about social housing to make it, or just get an answer.
But in Vienna, it's subsidized housing. The notion of social housing presented by DSA is that you have a market rate, you integrate in a single building market rate and affordable units, and the market rate units somehow subsidize the affordable units over time. And that isn't how it works, certainly in this country. I've never been able to get from a democratic socialist what are the interests of the market rate homeowner in subsidizing in the same building a low-income person other than being a decent person. And if you rely on a housing program based upon human decency, I think you don't produce that many units. I don't quite understand. I wrote a piece in 48 Hills. I urge people to take a look at it, in which I discuss California's attempt to create a housing authority, a state housing authority, to produce new social housing in which its primary object is to increase residential density, is to use state money to buy units that are less dense than the allowable density would produce. Well, that is thousands of units that are occupied that will displace tens of thousands of people. It's a bizarre notion, at least as applied in the United States. I rest my case. Vienna doesn't have, Austria doesn't have as many people as California. We're talking about a scale far greater than quote unquote social housing in Holland or Vienna. We're talking about a continental country. I think we have the ability to do housing able to be afforded by people that doesn't require kind of a private eleemosynary belief on the part that I'll subsidize you in my building. Read what the state law in California was. It didn't pass. It's pretty amazing to me, and in many ways, it sounded like urban renewal. In many ways.
Are there any more questions for our speakers? Could our speakers help the Brigade Panthers build an agenda for affordable housing? I see a hand raised. Betsy, go ahead. Unmute yourself, though.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad I could join this conversation, even if belatedly. I have a lot of respect for all the work that Calvin Welch has done over decades. So my question, as a Gray Panther and also someone who's been involved in tiny house advocacy, as well as trying to find out more about the Vienna housing situation, which I agree is not really applicable. They've been building housing. The city has been building housing since the 1920s as a political, it's part of the political payback for electing the government. So we have a very different situation here in the US. But I do want to talk about the very low cost possibilities, not necessarily in San Francisco, but there has been an effort to create resident owned, resident managed mobile home park co-ops. Is happening in the state, but also tiny home villages that the city of San Francisco rejected and are now apparently this person is now being encouraged in Santa Fe, Amy Farah Weiss. But there's these experiments where we're not, do we really want a huge new class of renters who are now maybe governed by a benevolent, hopefully more benevolent form of landlord? Or can we actually support the build it yourself or manufactured housing? For $40K, you can have a nice house. What you need is land. So my question is very open-ended, but are you familiar with some of the experiments in resident managed co-living that Haight Street Commons has been doing very beautifully, and some of the experiments that haven't been permitted in San Francisco around tiny home living on public land, essentially creating manufactured home parks with very small scale houses where you walk out onto the land and you can get some density. Obviously not a high rise, but you can get some density there.
Okay, thank you, Betsy. We have about 5 minutes left, so
Yeah, that was long. Forgive me,
Okay.
Art. Any
okay.
response to those experiments or efforts?
Joseph, do you?
Calvin, you want to jump in first? Go ahead. I'm still kind of chewing on this one.
Well, where to start? We have a city-funded. Well, let me back up. Yes, we do not have a city housing department that actually builds housing. Never have. Community-based organizations came together in the 70s, formed community-based development corporations because of that fact. And because what the city did in redevelopment was to contract with for-profit developers using federal money. And we all knew how that didn't work out too well. Nor did the state mandated public housing system work very well. So in the 70s, faith and community-based organizations, tenant organizations, organizations that had fought urban renewal, came together and eventually formed the Council of Community Housing Organizations. And
so I'll just say, I really would like to bring us up to date. I'm actually very aware.
Well, right, but every one of Betsy, every one of the experiments that you were trying is in effect in San Francisco now, except manufactured homes. There are community, Parkview Commons is resident managed housing. There are several resident managed housing entities in amongst affordable housing. We have a community land trust in which
I'm well aware. I'm deeply involved with those groups. I'm asking explicitly about the movement to encourage the difference between resident owned and managed cooperative houses like the Haight Street Commons has been creating, and the possibility of, maybe not for San Francisco, but in general, of tiny home villages where at a fraction of the space and a fraction of the cost.
Okay,
Any-
Betsy,
and
we don't have time for a
could
back
be-
and forth.
Could
We're
be-
at
I'll just stop there.
the end of our meeting there. So let them answer.
Yeah, I'll just say there is a ton of innovation. Okay, I'll address the tiny homes thing in just a second, but there is a ton of innovation, as Calvin's saying. I think there's, in terms of like what's happening in the affordable housing communities and movements around affordable housing. Part of where we get stuck is that there's no funding support for those solutions. The city's been totally stuck in the low-income housing tax credit realm. Which is
cabal.
opposite. And I think we've been talking a lot throughout this conversation of the unwillingness of the state to put up significant funding for affordable housing and of our city to kind of break out of that low-income housing tax credit box, even though we raise a ton of money here in San Francisco for affordable housing. And we've also had a real problem in terms of city policy around disposition of our public lands. And I mean, just look at what happened with Balboa Reservoir and selling off half of that for market rate housing. We have an affordable housing crisis, and here we are selling off our land for market rate, our public land for affordable housing. For market rate housing. So as Calvin's saying, there's a ton of innovation here. This is one of the leading places in the country for affordable housing innovation. It's just been really hard to get the kind of funding support at the scale that we need to support those innovations.
Okay, I want to thank our speakers for coming to inform us about how we can get to affordable housing. We're at the end of our time. We're coming up on a SF Gray Panther membership meeting. Everybody's welcome to attend at 2:30. But thank you, Calvin, and thank you, Joseph. And if you can help the Gray Panthers come up with an agenda for affordable housing, we would love to. We have a new website we're developing. We'd like to have a page on affordable housing. And if anybody here wants to take it on and be an affordable housing advocate and do that for the Gray Panthers, we'd love it. But in the meantime, Calvin and Joseph, give us your ideas for what we should be demanding. And Joseph, remind us when the time comes for that meeting coming up, you mentioned in your remarks in November.